Thank you. And after this very good lunch, we will continue with the conference. And we will move now to France. And we will have the presentation of Christophe Chabrot from Université Lumiére, Lyon. The topic, of course, is the French royal power. The title of the presentation is the Paradoxical Framework of the French royal power. The video can be started.
Good morning, everybody, dear colleagues. I would like to warmly thank the Professor Elmer Balog for this research project Bulla Aurea, for this so interesting collective work that he coordinates and in which he integrated me, thank you, and for this day of bright conferences in Budapest, a city that I love very much, but today just by video. Well, I'm a researcher of the University of Lyon, Lyon 2, Lyon, and I could have spoken of the Bulla Aurea of Lyon of November the 18th, 1157, enacted by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. This was a time when Lyon was integrated in the Kingdom of Burgundy, a part of Holy Germanic Roman Empire, but located on the borders of the Kingdom of France. And to prevent the county of Lyon from falling under the control of its neighbor Count of Forez and the King of France, the Emperor Barbarossa attributed officially by this bulla all sovereignty over the county of Lyon to the Archbishop of Lyon, who was closed to him. But finally, the Count of Forez refused this Bulla Aurea and invaded the city of Lyon a few years later. And the county of Lyon became, at the end, in 1312, a French county playing the role of a border town. So I will thank you, and I will think of you, dear Professor Balog, who immersed me in this history of Bulla Aurea. The next time I take the bridge that spans the Rhone in Lyon, the Rhone was the river that formed the border between the Kingdom of France and the Empire. So I will think to the Lyon Bulla Aurea and to you the next time. But dear Professor, you finally asked me to speak more generally of the Kingdom of France and not of the only Lyon. And I will then interpret the notion of Bulla Aurea, or chrysobubble, as we say sometimes in French, from a general point of view as a superior text organizing the powers in order to make comparisons with the other studies presented in your research. We therefore explore here the roots of the true proto-constitutional law. France is often referred to as a model of a centralized state where Paris commands the population and the local authorities without any real counterpower or resistance. And it is more or less true. Since Clovis, the first king of all the Franks in 481, the various royal dynasties had indeed a continuous policy of victorious conquest over all the counts, dukes, and competing kings on the territory of France. And the royal jurists of the old regime, the ancient regime, as well as those of the French Revolution or the Napoleon or Republic's one, will consecrate in law this superiority of the central power. And even today, the superiority of the national sovereign, embodied in the only organs of the state, over all the other national or local powers, is the foundation of our system, political system. We even come to call our regime a republican monarchy or a monarchical republic for the more optimistic, and President Macron is often described as a Jupiter president, God on earth. Even if the reality and effectiveness of centralization can be discussed, in the construction of these strong nation-states, no counterpower has therefore managed to really emerge to challenge the monarch and impose him limits. However, we can find in history very interesting attempts to challenge and control this superiority of royal power based on legal texts that can be studied here. And I will briefly present those texts, referring for details to my written production. These texts are not exactly Bulla Aurea, in particular because they were enacted by the King of France, sometimes under influence, but for himself, or even against himself, and not to organize other powers as usually do classical crucial bubbles. We can note two periods in this progressive supervision of royal power in France. The first one is about the failed attempts to control the royal power by other external powers. And the second one, following this failure, concerned the adoption of texts endogenous to the monarchy intended to reinforce the power of the crown by paradoxically limiting the powers of the king. Let's see these two periods. And firstly, the impossible exogenous framework of royal power. Three Frankish Salian dynasties succeeded each other on the becoming throne of France. The Merovingian one, which began with Clovis in 481, the Carolingian one, following Charles Martel, king in 751, and Charlemagne crowned emperor in 800, of course, and the Cabochon one started with Hugues Capet, king in 987, and whose descendants will reign until 1789, and till the French Revolution, and then from 1814 to 1848. Initially, these Salian Franks, who came from Belgium and settled around Paris and Orléans, competed with other powers, other tribes, such as the Goths, the Burgundians, or the Celts still settled in French Brittany, for example. All the art of these Frankish kings will then be to extend their power to the south as far as the Mediterranean Sea, to the west in French Brittany, to the north to Flanders, and to the east till Germanic Roman Empire. What they will do by military conquest, marriages, or acquisitions, while affirming the legal and political superiority of the king himself. The king is emperor in his kingdom, said the jurists in the 13th century. But the success of this process will often be disputed. To stay within the framework of the Bulla Aurea study, I will just talk here about the strong opposition of the States General to this royal expansion and the major ordinances involved in. But it could be possible too to talk about the opposition expressed by the provincial parliaments, which were sometimes able to resist the king on several occasions. The States General are the grouping of the three orders of the society, as it is often found in Indo-European societies. The nobility, the class of who protect and direct, the clergy, those who pray, and the others, the third order, the third estate, the working class. All are subject to the king, to whom they own help and advice, according to the principle of feudal society. It was Philip IV, said as Lebel, the Nice, who brought together the first States General in 1302 to obtain the support of these social forces in his fight against the Pope. These states will then meet irregularly to settle questions of inheritance, region, or taxes. But when royalty is weakened, a real theory of power will arise based on this assembly and contesting the superiority of the king. Three strong moments mark this power struggle. The first attempt to control the king by the States General will take place in 1355 to 1358. We are at the beginning of the 100 Years' War against England, and the monarchy needs money to raise an army in 1355 or to pay the ransom to free King John II, the French king prisoner of the English, in 1357. In both cases, the king needs the agreement of the States General and is obliged to accept in exchange to sign a royal ordinance which puts the king and the tax administration in particular under the control of the States General. The too long, Ordinance of March 3rd, 1357, which reorganizes the entire monarchical system, goes particularly far in this control of the king, submitted by force by Étienne Marcel, the provost of the merchants of Paris, himself supported by a great popular revolt. France was on the verge of becoming a parliamentary monarchy. But the revolt will end up turning to the advantage of the king, and Étienne Marcel finished massacred by the people of Paris in August 1358. This ordinance of 1357 will then be immediately cancelled by the king, and the States General meeting in 1359 will show, on the contrary, all the support for the king in his fight against the English. Another attempt at submission by the king will take place at the meeting of the States General of 1413 to once again resolve a budgetary crisis. The opposition will this time be organized by the Duke of Burgundy, the eternal rival of the King of France. Here, too, based on the popular revolt in Paris, the king's opponents forced him, the king, to sign a very long ordinance of May 26, 1413, known as the Cabochon Ordinance, from the name of the head of the popular revolt, Simon Caboche. This Cabochon Ordinance was written by a commission composed of magistrates, religious and academics from the Sorbonne University, and put royalty and all its administration under the control of councils appointed by the States General, pushing very far this general framework of the monarchy and the various bodies of the state. But again, the revolt ends up being put down, and the king, supported by the Armagnacs group, duchy of the southwest of France, emerges victorious in September from this confrontation with the Duke of Burgundy. He repudiated this ordinance of May 1357, had it torn up in public, and once again became master of the States General, which would gradually come under his total control. A last attempt to affirm the power of the assemblies will be heard during the Estates General of Tours in 1484, gathered to discuss the regency of the King Charles VIII, still a minor. On this occasion, the Grand Seneschal of Burgundy, Philippe Pot, will hold a famous speech to assert that the king comes from the States General, and that is therefore those states who recover power in the event of the king's minority or impediment, and who are therefore competent to appoint the regents. This very modern position, which founds a real popular or parliamentary democracy, will indeed be the one adopted at the end of the Estates General of Tours, but in an ambiguous formulation which ultimately will remove all its force from this theory, which will not be taken up again later. And finally, all requests such as the annual or even permanent meeting of the states, the legal force given to their grievances and conclusions, or the creation of their own bodies to control the monarchy will be then rejected. On the contrary, it will be the royal jurists like Jean Bodin in 1576 in his 6 books of the Republic who will develop the theories of the sovereignty of the king, of his perpetual and absolute superiority. And the States General will then meet very irregularly and not at all from 1615 until 1789, the date of the revolution, replaced by small private councils around the king, who instead inaugurates an absolute monarchy. But paradoxically, this monarchy no longer being framed from the outside, it is from the inside that it will feel the need to put limits on the powers of the king in order to strengthen the power of the crown itself. So let's see this second point, the paradoxical endogenous framework of royal power. So no power has succeeded in imposing itself on the French king from outside, such as the English barons or the Parliament of Westminster, forcing the king to sign the Magna Carta of 1215 or the Bill of Rights of 1689. The 2 great French ordinances we saw of 1357 and 1413 will last only the time of a revolt and will be quickly denounced by the king, who will even seek to to reinforce his power, to avoid undergoing this control of the States General. A succession crisis will show the need for the monarchy to protect itself from within against the king himself. And after that, the monarchy began to adopt various great laws of the kingdom, as we said, that people and all holders of the crown, too, will have to respect. The first crisis will intervene on the problem of succession. After the Cabochon miracle, which allows the kings of France to always give a son successor from 987 to 1316, after this Cabochon miracle, a period of uncertainty began with the death of Philippe le Bel, all his sons succeeding him dying without a male successor. Initially, it is by affirming the weight of tradition since 987 and the fragility of the weaker sex that jurists could rule out the succession of women, such as Joan of Navarre, daughter of Louis X, in favor of the brothers of the king. But with the King of England, who claims the throne of France for the son he had with Isabelle, the daughter of Philippe le Bel, the French king, it will be necessary to find more solid arguments, especially when the rejection by the States General of this English successor will lead to the 100 Years' War between France and England till 1453. Jurists will then rediscover the old Salic law, long forgotten, that is to say, this long text from Clovis in 511, putting in writing the customs of the first Salian Franks. We keep an historical copy dating from 800 in the National Library, accessible by internet, and I put the references in my written production. And the Article 62 of this law, which normally applies only to families under private law, specifies that women cannot inherit land and titles, to avoid the impoverishment of the daughter's family in favor of the one of the husband. The royal jurists, French jurists, will extrapolate this provision to lay down the main rules of succession to the throne, prohibiting the transmission of kingdom lands and crown by daughters. So they can refer to this fundamental law to oppose English claims and even to contest the Treaty of Troyes of 1420. In effect, in this treaty, signed by the mentally frail King Charles VI, under the influence of the Duke of Burgundy, which is an ally of English, the French king accepted the marriage of his daughter with the English king and transmitted to the latter his crown on his death. So great French jurists refused the terms of this treaty, which was contrary to the Salic law. And from this Salic disposition, which normally didn't concern royalty, a whole functional and statutory theory of royal power was constructed, elaborated in particular by Jean de Terre Vermeil, who asserted that the crown was not a personal property of the king, a property which he could dispose of, but a function which imposes its rules and duties on him and has its own rules of transmission, by male successor, for example, and not by female. Later, jurists asserted that this transmission of the crown was even automatic, never depending on any act of will or wish of the king. What sums up the adage, the king is dead, long life to the king. The king cannot free himself from those rules of succession, even by treaty. He must respect them. To these rules of succession and status of crown coming from a special interpretation of the Salic law, other texts will be added to prevent the king from impoverishing the crown by squandering its assets, by selling its property. The Edict of Moulins, for example, of 1566, affirms the inalienability of crown property, which can therefore never be transferred, not sold. Jurists added to this principle of inalienability the one of imprescriptibility. Even if a royal property is given by loan or given as an appanage to family of the king, for example, transmissible by inheritance, this gift does not remove this land from royal property, even after several decades. So, for example, French king could reintegrate the royal domain in 1361, the Burgundy appanage given to the brother of the king in 1032. And when this Duchy of Burgundy is again given to the son of the king in 1364, it will come back to the royal domain in 1477, while the successor of the duchy was a female, Mary of Burgundy, excluded of the succession as a woman by the Salic law. And I must point out that these principles of inalienability and imprescriptibility are still in force in current public law. Moreover, the powers of the provincial parliaments, the office of judges, and the use of French as official language of the kingdom by the Edict of Villers-Cotterêts of 1539, or the general organization of the kingdom by the Edicts of Blois of 1579, for example, will complete these great laws of the kingdom, which frame the powers of the king to the benefit of the reinforcement of the power of the crown as a paradox. Should these laws, edicts, be placed in the category of bulla aurea? Well, perhaps not exactly, but they nevertheless remain major texts produced by royalty itself to organize and strengthen itself through this endogenous limitation. But no wanted to exceed my speaking time, and I prefer to stop here waiting for your question. Thank you for listening.